Pig reads Moby Dick, Chapter 3. The Spouter Inn. Entering that gable-ended Spouter Inn, you found yourself in a wide, low, straggling entry with old-fashioned wainscots, reminding one of the bulwarks of some condemned old craft. On one side hung a very large oil painting, so thoroughly besmoked and every way defaced that in the unequal cross lights by which you viewed it, it was only by diligent study and a series of systematic visits to it and careful inquiry of the neighbors that you could anyway arrive at an understanding of its purpose. Such unaccountable masters of shades and shadows that at first you almost thought some ambitious young artists in the time of the New England hags had endeavored to delineate chaos bewitched. But by dint of much and earnest contemplation and oft-repeated ponderings, and especially by throwing open the little window towards the back of the entry, you at last come to the conclusion that such an idea, however wild, might not be altogether unwarranted. But what most puzzled and confounded you was a long, limber, portentous black mass of something hovering in the center of the picture over three blue, dim, perpendicular lines floating in a nameless yeast. A boggy, soggy, squitchy picture truly, enough to drive a nervous man distracted. Yet there was a sort of indefinite, half-attained, unimaginable sublimity about it that fairly froze you to it, till you involuntarily took an oath and yourself to find out what that marvelous painting meant. Ever and anon a bright, but alas, deceptive idea would dart you through. It's the Black Sea in a midnight gale. It's the unnatural combat of the four primal elements. It's a blasted health. It's a Hyperborean winter scene. It's the breaking up of the icebound steam of time. But at last all these fancies yielded to that one portentous something in the picture's midst. That one found out, and all the rest were plain. But stop, does it not bear a faint resemblance to a gigantic fish, even the great Leviathan himself? In fact, the artist's design seemed this, a final theory of my own, partly based on the aggregated opinions of many aged persons with whom I conversed upon the subject. The picture represents a Cape Horner in a great hurricane. The half-foundered ship weltering there with its three dismantled masts alone visible, and an exasperated whale proposing to spring clean over the craft. Is the enormous act of impaling himself upon the three mastheads. The opposite wall of this entry was hung all over with a heathenish array of monstrous clubs and spears. Some were thickly set with glittering teeth resembling ivory saws, others were tufted with knots of human hair, and one was sickle-shaped with a vast handle sweeping round like the segment made in the new mown grass by a long-armed mower. You shuddered as you gazed and wondered what monstrous cannibal and savage could ever have gone death harvesting with such a hacking, horrifying implement. Mixed with these were rusty old whaling lances and harpoons, all broken and deformed. Some were storied weapons. With this once long lance, now wildly elbowed, 50 years ago did Nathan Swain kill 15 whales between a sunrise and a sunset. And that harpoon, so like a corkscrew now, was flung in Javan seas and run away with by a whale years afterwards, slain off the Cape of Blanco. The original iron entered nigh the tail, and like a restless needle sojourning in the body of a man, traveled full 40 feet, and at last was found embedded in the hump. Crossing this dusky entry, and on through yon low arched way, cut through what in old times might have been a great central chimney with fireplaces all around, you enter the public room. A still duskier place is this, with such low ponderous beams above, and such old wrinkled planks beneath, that you would almost fancy you trod some old craft's cockpits, especially of such a howling night, when this corner-anchored old ark rocked so furiously. On one side stood a long, low shelf-like table covered with cracked glass cases, filled with dusty rarities gathered from this wide world's remotest nooks. Projecting from the further angle of the room stands a dark-looking den, the bar, a rude attempt at a right whale's head. Be that how it may, there stands the vast arched bone of the whale's jaw, so wide a coach might almost drive beneath it. Within are shabby shelves ranged round with old decanters, bottles, flasks, and in those jaws of swift destruction, like another cursed Jonah, by which name indeed they called him, bustles a little withered old man, who, for their money, dearly sells the sailors' deliriums and death. Abominable are the tumblers into which he pours his poison, though true cylinders within the villainous green goggling glass deceitfully tapered downwards to a cheating bottom. Parallel meridians rudely pecked into the glass surround those footpads goblets. Fill to this mark, and your charge is but a penny. To this a penny more, and so on to the full glass, the Cape Horn measure, which you may gulp down for a shilling. Upon entering the place, I found a number of young seamen gathered around a table, examining by a dim light divers specimens of scrimshander. I sought the landlord, and telling my desire to be accommodated with a room, received for answer that his house was full, but not a bed unoccupied. But avast, he added, tapping his forehead, you ain't no objections to sharing a harpooner's blanket, have ye? I suppose you're going to go whaling, so you better get used to that sort of thing. I told him that I never liked to sleep two in a bed, that if I should ever do so, it would depend on who the harpooner might be, and that if he, the landlord, really had no other place for me, and the harpooner was not decidedly objectionable, why, rather than wander about a strange town on so bitter a night, I would put up with half of any decent man's blanket. I thought so. All right, take a seat. Supper? You want supper? Supper will be ready directly. I sat down on an old wooden settle, carved all over like a bench on the battery. At one end, a ruminating tar was still further adorning it with his jackknife, stooping over and diligently working away at the space between his legs. He was trying his hand at a ship under full sail, but he didn't make much headway, I thought. At last, some 4 or 5 of us were summoned to our meal in the adjoining room. It was as cold as Iceland, no fire at all. The landlord said he couldn't afford it. Nothing but 2 dismal tallow candles, each in a winding sheet. We were fain to button up our monkey jackets and hold to our lips cups of scalding tea with our half-frozen fingers. But the fare was of the most substantial kind, not only meat and potatoes, but dumplings. Good heavens, dumplings for supper. One young fellow in a green box coat addressed himself to these dumplings in a most direful manner. My boy, said the landlord, you'll have the nightmare to a dead sartainty. Landlord, I whispered, that ain't the harpooner, is it? Oh no, said he, looking a sort of diabolically funny. The harpooner is a dark-complexioned chap. He never eats dumplings. He don't. He eats nothing but steaks and likes 'em rare. The devil he does, says I. Where is that harpooner? Is he here? He'll be here before long, was the answer. I could not help it, but I began to feel suspicious of this dark-complexioned harpooner. At any rate, I made up my mind that if it so turned out that we should sleep together, he must undress and get into bed before I did. Supper over, the company went back to the bar-room when, knowing not what else to do with myself, I resolved to spend the rest of the evening as a looker-on. Presently a rioting noise was heard without. Starting up, the landlord cried, that's the Grampus crew. I seed her reported in the offing this morning. A 3 years voyage and a full ship. Hurrah, boys. Now we'll have the latest news from the Fijis. A tramping of sea boots was heard in the entry. The door was flung open, and in rolled a wild set of mariners enough. Enveloped in their shaggy watch coats and with their heads muffled in woolen comforters, all bed-armed and ragged, and their beards stiff with icicles, they seemed an eruption of bears from Labrador. They had just landed from their boat, and this was the first house they entered. No wonder, then, that they went straight wake for the whale's mouth, the bar, when the wrinkled little old Jonah, there officiating, soon poured them out brimers all around. One complained of a bad cold in his head, upon which Jonah mixed him a pitch-like potion of gin and molasses, which he swore was a sovereign cure for all colds and catarrhs whatsoever, never mind of how long standing, or whether caught off the coast of Labrador or on the weather side of an ice island. The liquor soon mounted into their heads, as it generally does, even with the Orantis toppers newly landed from sea, and they began capering about most obstreperiously. I observed, however, that one of them held somewhat aloof, and though he seemed desirous not to spoil the hilarity of his shipmates by his own sober face, yet upon the whole he refrained from making as much noise as the rest. This man interested me at once, and since the sea gods had ordained that he should soon become my shipmate, though but a sleeping partner one, so far as this narrative is concerned, I will here venture upon a little description of him. He stood full foot 6 feet in height, with noble shoulders and a chest like a cofferdam. I have seldom seen such brawn in a man. His face was deeply brown and burnt, making his white teeth dazzling by contrast, while in the deep shadows of his eyes floated some reminiscences that did not seem to give him much joy. His voice at once sounded like he was a southerner, and from his fine stature, I thought he must be one of those tall mountaineers from the Alleghanian Ridge in Virginia. When the revelry of his companions had mounted to his height, this man slipped away unobserved, and I saw no more of him till he became my comrade on the sea. In a few minutes, however, he was missed by his shipmates, and being, it seems, for some reason a huge favorite with them, they raised a cry of, "Bulkington! Bulkington! Where is Bulkington?" and darted out of the house in pursuit of him. It was now about 9 o'clock, and the room seeming almost supernaturally quiet after these orgies, I began to congratulate myself upon a little plan that occurred to me just previous to the entrance of the seamen. No man prefers to sleep two in a bed. In fact, you would not a good deal rather not sleep with your own brother. I don't know how it is, but people like to be private when they're sleeping. And when it comes to sleeping with an unknown stranger in a strange inn in a strange town, and that stranger a harpooner, then your objections indefinitely multiply. Nor was there any earthly reason why I, as a sailor, should sleep two in a bed more than anybody else. For sailors no more sleep two in a bed at sea than bachelor kings do ashore. To be sure, they all sleep together in one apartment, but you have to have your own hammock and cover yourself with your own blanket and sleep in your own skin. The more I pondered over this harpooner, the more I abominated the thought of sleeping with him. It was fair to presume that being a harpooner, his linen or woolen, as the case might be, would not be of the tidiest, certainly none of the finest. I began to twitch all over. Besides, it was getting late, and my decent harpooner ought to be home and going bedwards. Suppose now he should tumble in upon me at midnight. How could I tell what vile hole he had been coming? From what vile hole he had been coming? "Landlord, I changed my mind about the harpooner. I shan't sleep with him. I'll try the bench here." "Just as you please. I'm sorry I can't spare you a tablecloth for a mattress, and it's a plaguey rough board here," feeling of the knots and notches. "But wait a minute, Scrimshander. I've got a carpenter's plane there in the bar. Wait, I say it. I'll make it snug enough." So saying, he procured the plane, and with his old silk handkerchief first dusting the bench, vigorously set to planing away at my bed, the while grinning like an ape. The shavings flew right and left, till at last the plain iron came bump against an indestructible knot. The landlord was near spraining his wrist, and I told him for heaven's sake to quit. The bed was soft enough to suit me, and I did not know how all the planing in the world could make eider down of a pine plank. So, gathering up the shavings with another grin and throwing them into the great stove in the middle of the room, he went about his business and left me in a brown study. And I'll take a break there, halfway through chapter 3, the Spouter Inn. Peg reads Moby.